Well, good morning. It's good to see you all this morning. They tell me that we're going to have a cold front, so it's pretty exciting. Get a little bit of cool weather coming through. I know Brent's excited. He's got his sweater on this morning in preparation. Never can be too early in Florida to get your jackets and sweaters out. Never know when you're going to need them. I guess we kind of do, but anyway, it's exciting. Cool weather coming. One of my favorite words in the English language is an Old English word, apricity. And it means the feeling of the warm sun on a cold day, which is just one of the most pleasant thoughts. However, I have found it incredibly difficult to work apricity into my everyday conversation. So I have to use it in introductions to sermons because otherwise there would be no opportunity for me to use the word apricity. I've tried it. Isn't the apricity wonderful today? It just doesn't really work. But you could try it. And if you figure out a way to use it, let me know. I'd be happy to hear your suggestions about that. A few weeks ago, I preached a sermon on the number one, how there is only one thing to pray for, one request I make of you, one thing you lack, one thing is needful, one thing I know, and one thing to do. Thought about that a little bit. If you're going to do one thing, you might as well do two things, right? So I figured we would talk about the number two this morning and just continue it rolling forward. And, you think about the number one. Some say it's the loneliest number, at least the 11 spoonful do. But if one is the loneliest number, then two has to be the most contentious number, doesn't it? I mean, there's two sides to every argument. And in fact, it does take two to argue. There are always two sides to every coin. And maybe, in the words of the old country music song, there are two stories in every house. His story and her story. But when you consider the Bible, we see the number two as well. See some of these ideas. There are two lights hung in the heavens, the greater light and the lesser light. The Bible itself is divided into two testaments that represent the two broad covenants with man. There are two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11, and the 12 are sent out in pairs by Jesus in Mark 6. The animals are loaded into the ark two by two, and so we see throughout the Bible this repetition of the number two. But I think primarily the number two, in and of itself, suggests some sort of duality, some sort of division. And it's obvious when you're reading the Bible, because right there at the beginning, it begins with this kind of dualistic nature, this idea of the stark and simple contrast of light and dark, black and white. There's one or two choices. You can go this way or that way, and that's all. And so in the very beginning, the Bible asserts the division between light and dark, day and night. In Genesis 1:4, God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And so it serves as a fundamental metaphor for the whole rest of Scriptures, a powerful metaphor, one that is so fundamental that encapsulates so much of how we see the world that it becomes a representation of the Jedi forces of light and dark, right? And we recognize that and see it because light and dark are opposites. And of course, if you were ever going to preach a politically incorrect sermon, it's this one, right? Because the secularists hate the simple-minded, absolute, stark contrast that this provides. They love the gray, right? They love to take things that are good and make them evil, and things that are evil and make them good, and throw everything together in this kind of gray middle ground. 1 Thessalonians 5:5 says, "For you are all sons of light and sons of day. We are not of night or of darkness. You are one or the other." In Leviticus 27:12, it says, "The priest shall value it as either good or bad. As you, the priest, value it, so shall it be." And what he's doing here is talking about the consecrated animal. And this valuation is simple, it is clear, and it's fundamental to the way that God tells us to appraise the world. It is good or it is bad. And sometimes that's all there is. Psalm 37:27 says, "Depart from evil and do good, so you will abide forever." It doesn't say depart from evil and kind of find your niche in between the good and the bad. It says leave the evil and go to the good. Romans 6:16 says, "Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one you obey? Either sin resulting in death or obedience resulting in righteousness." Those are the options. Those are the two alternatives. I mean, this duality exists in terms of love and hate too. Matthew 6:24, "No one can serve two masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other." You cannot serve God and wealth. You have to choose. You're only going to love one and you're going to hate the other. You have to make a choice. Duality exists in terms of life and death. Deuteronomy 30 and verse 19 says, "I call heaven and earth to witness against you today, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and the curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants." You got to choose one or the other. Two men representing these two choices. The two criminals on the cross next to Jesus. It says in Luke 23:32, "Two others also who were criminals were being led away to be put to death with him." None of this happens by chance or fortune. It's not really the way that God's plan works, right? It was by God's design that there were two thieves crucified with him. And they represent then these two classes of men. Both criminals, both worthy of death, both suffering what their crimes have brought them to. Both see Jesus and observe his prayers. Both see him forgive those who are crucifying him. There's a pretty big contrast between these two men, isn't there? In Luke 23:39, it says, "One of the criminals who were hanged there was hurling abuse at him, saying, 'Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us.' But the other answered, rebuking him, 'Do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? We indeed are suffering justly, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong.' And he was saying, 'Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.' And he said to him, 'Truly I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise.'" Two alternatives. Two circumstances that are the same, but two different choices made. One is saved, and the other, we may suppose, him having cursed with his last breath, was killed by a society he had warred against and was punished in the afterlife by a God he had rebelled against in his life and blasphemed in his death. I think that's a safe assumption. Men today say things like, "I want to be saved like the thief on the cross." Well, no one really wants to be saved like the thief on the cross, right? At least not literally. But we can all be saved like the thief in reality. For all of us are like him, condemned to death by our crimes against God, and must cry out in mercy to God to save us, since we can't save ourselves. Now, of course, what people mean by that is that they want to live their life in crime, life of self-service, and then at the last moment call on the Lord and he will be saved. Perhaps that can happen, but it's pretty doubtful that such an insincere call can be heard by the Lord. It says in 1 Peter 3:12, "For the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, and his ears attend to their prayer, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil." But today, we can know more of the Lord and his people than the thief did. We have more before us, more to see. We don't have to die on the cross. We can die in baptism. Romans 6 talks specifically about that. What is baptism? It's obedience, it's service to God, it's salvation, it does all these things, but fundamentally baptism is a death. Romans 6:3, "Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we would no longer be slaves to sin. For he who has died is free from sin. Now if we have died with Christ, we believe that we also shall live with him, knowing that Christ, having been raised from the dead, is never to die again. Death no longer is master over him, for the death that he died to sins once for all. but the life that he lives to God. Even so, consider yourselves to be dead to sin, but alive to God in Christ Jesus. The two alternatives, right? Life, death, righteousness, sin. There's a cost. And you see it here. Baptism is the death, the consequence, so that we can have life, so we can have that other alternative. But these two men express two attitudes, don't they? Because there's only two attitudes towards spiritual things. We may want to chop it up differently, but there's only two attitudes. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, "But a natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, and he cannot understand them because they are spiritually appraised. But he who is spiritual appraises all things, yet he himself is appraised by no one." Are you the natural man or are you the spiritual man? Do you have the right attitude towards these things? There has to be a change to take place so you can see these things as you should. John 1:5 says it like this, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." If you're in the dark, you don't understand it. You don't see it. You either understand and appreciate these spiritual things of God or you reject them. Galatians 5:16 says this, "But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law." He says, you got to choose here, right? And if you choose the spiritual things of God and you walk that way, you're not going to desire the things of the flesh. They're in opposition to these things that God is leading us towards. You got to choose. Some men learn to love the truth and to love righteousness, not for what it can bring them, but for what it is in and of itself. They love and value honesty and integrity and truth and righteousness and the fruit of the Spirit and these things that God has shown us. Not because of some benefit, not because they are trying to get a gold crown in heaven, but because they love the value of those things. And there are other people that look at that way of life and look at those virtues and say that they don't understand at all what they are or what they mean. They can't conceive of such a life. And the alternative is that they live the life that the Ecclesiastes writes of in Ecclesiastes 1:2. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Without the things of the spiritual nature and the things that we appraise in terms of righteousness, the result is what the preacher offers here. He says, "What advantage does man have in all his work which he does under the sun? A generation goes, a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Also the sun rises, the sun sets, and hastening to its place it rises there again, blowing towards the south, then turning toward the north. The wind continues swirling along, and on its circular courses the wind returns. All the rivers flow into the sea, yet the sea isn't full. To the place where the rivers flow, they flow again. All things are wearisome. Man's not able to tell it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear is filled with hearing. That which has been is that which will be, and that which has been done is that which will be done. So there's nothing new under the sun." If you remove righteousness and you remove this perspective and understanding of God, and you look at your life and you look at the existence of the world, it's all been done before. It's all cyclical. It all comes and it all goes, and it's all vanity and means nothing. But that's the contrast, right? As opposed to those who serve God and those who live in righteousness and those who value the fruit of the Spirit. Each day in and of itself is a blessing and an opportunity to show righteousness. Those things in and of themselves become powerful and meaningful, as opposed to rivers flowing into the ocean and never filling it up, never accomplishing anything, never being satisfied. Those that are righteous see it differently. Looking into the dust and living in the dust and believing the dust is everything, because they can't bring themselves to look at the God who is above the sun. And what this all means, you got one choice with only two alternatives. Matthew 12:30 says, "He who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters." That's all there is. You're with him or you're against him. There's no middle ground. Sure, we'd love for there to be lots of alternatives. We'd love for there to be all sorts of middle ground, all sorts of gray, all sorts of other places and choices. But there's not. And I would warn you, be careful about wanting too many choices. We can be stunned by choices, paralyzed by the choices. I mean, we're getting into that season, right? Choices of presence. Which model, which feature, which thing matters the most? Should we get this one or the blue one or the red one, right? And it goes on and on. But for us as Christians, there's only two choices. Either for Jesus, to submit to him, to accept him as Lord and Savior, or to reject him and fight against him. Some like to believe that he has no moral claims over their life. He's just another nice man with some nice teachings that might make your life a little bit better, right? Just a philosopher. People say those sorts of things. But there's no middle ground. You're for him or against him. C.S. Lewis said it this way: either he's a liar and a lunatic, or he's the Lord. There's nothing else in between. Others have phrased it like this: he's mad and bad, or he's God. You got to choose which one you believe. And he himself divides all of mankind into two as well. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 7 says, "Therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and slammed against the house, and yet it didn't fall, for it had been founded on the rock. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew, slammed against the house, and it fell. And great was its fall." When Jesus finished these words, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as their scribes. And no wonder they were amazed. No one else would dare say the outcomes of life are determined by whether or not you accept my words. Build your life on my words or reject them and die because of it. No one else would dare say that. So either he's a lunatic or he's the Lord. You got to choose. We'd like there to be a lot of choices. Maybe a slightly easier way with maybe a slightly better outcome than hell or something, right? That we could just kind of thread the needle between what allows us to do what we want to do and then not be punished too bad for it, right? That's not the choice that's before us, though. And note that it will be a surprise to many to have it pointed out to them what they have chosen. Also in Matthew 7:21, it says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' And I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness.'" In other words, not everybody who is talking about heaven is going to heaven. Many will think that they've chosen a middle path. And although they may not have been that religious, and although they may not have known their Bible that well, they don't deserve hell, surely. And others will have been so blindly fanatic about their own limited, twisted view of Jesus that they never really saw him at all until he stands before them in Judgment Day and repudiates them. It's the harsh reality. There are only the two groups. In Matthew 25:31, he says, "But when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he'll put the sheep on his right hand and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Then he will also say to those on his left, "Depart from me, accursed ones, into eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels." This is the lesson maybe that we see of the most famous two in the Bible. The parable of the son, the prodigal son in Luke 15. It says in Luke 15:11, a man had two sons. And we know the story, don't we? Two sons. One son grabs his inheritance and runs off to another country, wastes it, squanders it, and when he's at rock bottom and has nothing left, he comes home, begging for mercy from his father. We're familiar with that son. He's the prodigal because he wasted his substance in a faraway land, but he repented. The very literal meaning of the word. He turned, came back to his father's house, received joyfully from his father, restored to his position as a son. But there's two sons. And the other son refused to go into his father's house out of jealousy. Think about that for a moment. The father's house is right before him, and he refuses to enter. Luke 15:28, it says, "But he became angry and was not willing to go in, and his father came out and began pleading with him." The father comes out of the house just like he did for the other son. He pleads with him just like he did for the other son. But he argued against the father's grace, and he refused to come in. And this particular issue here of this other son is left in doubt. We don't know what ends up happening to the other son. But we do know the lesson, don't we? We can be lost in a faraway country and squander our inheritance that way. Or we can be lost at home, right outside the Father's house. But either way, you're still lost. We are all in need of the Father's mercy. And we ought to hear his voice as he comes out of his house and invites us in. Brent talked about this with the Lord's Supper, right? Two people there. It's not politically correct. Say there's only two choices. Say there's only good and bad. It may be the thing that society wars against the most. It may be the thing that is the most distasteful to them about Christianity. They don't mind when we talk about love and forgiveness, but they don't like it when we say you only have two choices. And yet here we are with a hard lesson. There are some sermons that are easy to preach because they're uplifting and encouraging and positive, and there's some that are hard. This is a hard one. It's not as fun to preach. It's not fun for you to listen to probably either. But the fact of the matter is, whether we love it or hate it, there are only two alternatives. We have one choice to make and only two options. We have to decide which son we're going to be. We're all sinners. We've all been invited back in, but which one are we going to be? And let us be careful and never let us say that his grace is too much, that he's forgiven too many people, that it's too kind, that it's too widely extended. The fact of the matter is, the more it abounds, the better our chances of being included too, since we're all sinners and we all need to be invited in. We are all saved by grace, not by merit, not by the works that we've done. The question is, which choice do we make? Which path do we go down? And so the option is before all of us. This morning, every day, choices we make. Do we see the world as stark as the Bible outlines it? Do we see the alternatives before us as simply as Jesus lays them out for us? What do we choose? We already referenced it earlier in the sermon, but there's only life and death. Those are the only options. And God in His wisdom has provided an opportunity for life, even though we deserve death. Now, that opportunity for life still demands death, doesn't it? Death of the watery grave, as we talked about, but it is a process in which we can be raised to walk in newness of life and stand with Him. So this morning, I leave you with the two choices. Whether you need to respond to an invitation now to be baptized, whether you need our prayers to encourage you. I want you to think about that, though. Which of the two choices, alternatives, are you making on a daily basis? Are you standing with God or against Him? Because there's nothing in between. If we can baptize you or pray for you, please let us know as we stand and sing this song.